A new weapon. For the first time I met the second lieutenant commanding my new outfit, Heavy K-Flak Battery No. 179. Lieutenant Browse was a dealer in lumber in private life. He was about 40 years old, very friendly and easy to get along with. Lieutenant Browse obviously loved the good life, and I wondered how we would find enough food to keep his big stomach well filled. Our training course took 3 weeks and was quite pleasant. The new 88mm gun carried a considerably more powerful punch than the 77mm gun. Now we could engage enemy flyers much earlier while they were still far away from their targets. We had 2 guns, each drawn by a tractor that was equipped with a steel rope to pull the gun out of any ditch or deep mud. But our most prized possession was a small 2-seater type of open sports car for the use of Lieutenant Browse and myself. Lille was only about 8 miles behind the front lines and close to the Belgian-French border. My diary mentions frequent bombings. One day, just as Lieutenant Browse and I were leaving our comfortable quarters, a bomb or shell hit 2 elderly civilians and one of our soldiers. The civilians were killed, while we dragged the wounded man into the door of our quarters. The next day a bomb hit a children's school while in session. Everybody ran there to help. I did not go for fear the sight of bombed children would make me sick. The destructive power of bombs seemed to increase all the time. A British Handley Page bomber used bombs of 1,000 kilos. Bombs of 300 kilos were in daily use. Even the small 50-kilo bombs had a destructive power equal to a 15 centimeters. Shell and anybody who had survived a nearby explosion of a 15 centimeters. Shell would testify that such a shell could do fearful damage. All these missiles had to be feared. A 122-kilo bomb dropped on living targets moving on hard ground would burst into 1,400 pieces, each one sizzling parallel to the ground, and could cause very bad wounds. By this time, enemy tank tactics also were well developed and much feared, especially because the German army had missed the boat. We had only a few. Only artillery could hope to cope with this menace, and we had special instructions as to how our 88mm guns should be used against tanks. Tanks advanced in front of enemy infantry, firing their machine guns and cannons. They had a speed of only 4 miles per hour, but were able to overrun infantry with ease, unless the troops were supported by plenty of well-trained field artillery or K-Flak. However, there was not enough artillery on our side to successfully fight the swarms of tanks now appearing on the battlefields. In attacking a field artillery battery, the tanks would spread out and finally attack from the rear, mowing down the gun crews with their cannons and machine guns. We had no good defense against it. On May 2nd, 1918, the guns and equipment were turned over to us. The next day we were shipped on flat cars to Valenciennes to protect an army headquarters. We barely were in position when 7 de Havilland bombers attacked the town. I thought our shooting was very poor. Many members of the crew were elderly men, which made me think we were scraping the bottom of the barrel. They were too slow, and by the time they executed the commands, the bombers were miles away. The next day, 5 de Havillands came back, and our shooting was better. We scattered the formation. On May 29th, we had a substantial night attack by bombers, but the searchlight crew never managed to hold the targets long enough for us to take our measurements and observe the explosions. Suddenly, on June 8th, we were loaded on flat cars again and had no idea of our destination. We asked the train personnel, but they were under orders not to tell. We went through Luxembourg, and after 3 days of travel, we unloaded at Metz on the Mosel River. Metz was one of the strongest German fortresses, built as a countermeasure to the French fortress at Verdun, 35 miles due west. Metz was about 7 to 10 miles behind the Saint-Mihiel front, now held by the newly arrived American army under General Pershing. This front had been quiet for several years because, from a strategic point of view, it offered no prospects to either side, although it was a suitable training ground for inexperienced troops. The arrival of American soldiers enabled French soldiers to be thrown into the battles now raging further north along the Western Front. It was quite difficult for me to grasp the fact that the soldiers opposing us were Americans, willing and eager to fight. All of my father's overseas friends were Americans. They had come to our house often and were outgoing, friendly types. From my earliest childhood, I remember one who was a tobacco man from Virginia. He came every year, bringing with him a barrel of delicious Virginia apples for us. In addition, my brother was an American citizen. When he arrived in the United States in 1908, he was a trained soldier of the 23rd Field Artillery Regiment, stationed in Koblenz. Now he was an American. When the United States entered the war in April 1917, it needed all the trained soldiers it could get. I was sure they had drafted him, and that he probably was right in front of us among the 1 million American soldiers now on French soil. We had not heard from him for more than a year. All this disturbed me very much. That we now had to face all these American soldiers was proof to me that our diplomats must have been the worst in the world. It was unbelievable. After the American declaration of war, I had many discussions with my family as to the importance of it. When young, my father was rejected for some physical defect and did not have to serve in the army. Things military did not interest him at all. He had been in Kentucky and Virginia several times, and in his opinion, Americans would make poor soldiers because they were unable to subject themselves to rigid discipline. Apart from this, many German people who had lifelong dealings with Americans felt vaguely that they simply would not fight us, even if their government told them to do so. This feeling was based on the fact that we seemed to have no grounds for a quarrel. Yes, American citizens had lost their lives on the Lusitania, but why did they choose to travel on a British liner carrying ammunition? And President Wilson's pronouncements concerning democracy and liberty touched a subject rather strange and unfamiliar to even the most educated German. The German people were quite content with their form of government. Furthermore, so my father thought, America had no army to speak of, and there was nothing in its history to suggest a military mind. I could not agree with this viewpoint, and when I read to my family some data concerning the American Civil War, they were astonished to find that both sides had lost more men than Germany had fighting in the Franco-German War. The Union and Confederacy fought each other with the utmost tenacity for 4 years. Yes, but they have no skill, they said. To this I could only answer that 85% of their soldiers were of Anglo-Saxon or German extraction. They had been training for more than a year now, and would be just as good as the Germans and British were when the war started in 1914. And soldiers on both sides then were good enough to kill each other wholesale. Protecting Metz. The country around Metz looked somewhat like the low hills of Pennsylvania. Metz was surrounded by forts, all of them on hills. Our battery was stationed on top of one of these hills, from where we could see into the valley of the Mosel River for miles. It was very pretty country. Since the arrival of the American army, Metz had become an important depot, which needed protection from constantly increasing air attacks. The civilian population had not been evacuated, and life went on more or less in normal fashion. Enemy bombers concentrated on the areas around the railway station where all of the depots were located. As far as military activities were concerned, for us it was a war deluxe. The forts were constructed of concrete and earth 15 feet thick, immune to the heaviest artillery fire known. Deep inside were our quarters, warm and comfortable with beds, chairs and tables. I had one huge room all to myself with a window looking out on the beautiful Mosel Valley. The 6 or 7 anti-aircraft batteries stationed on the surrounding hills were under the command of Captain of the Reserve Sol, an overaged professor of math from some university. He was very polite and precise and had worked out all kinds of formulas for the destruction of the bombers coming over regularly in good flying weather. But none of them worked. I cannot remember a single bomber coming down. The June weather was beautiful. Our battery commander, Lieutenant Browse, loved good wine, and a few yards from the guns the crew hand-built a sort of pergola where we could while away the summer days. Lieutenant Browse had had little war experience so far, and he apparently enjoyed trying his shooting skill. But with all the batteries shooting at the same time, it was impossible to trace our shots. I did very little firing, and was glad Lieutenant Browse took over most of that duty. He often mixed a fine drink for us consisting of Mosel wine, fizzy water and fresh peaches, perforated with a fork. We drank it under our precious pergola that was erected in the midst of flower beds planted by the crew. It was a most comfortable life. My diary says that on June 12, 1918, a squadron of 5 bombers came over, dropped bombs close to the depot and flew away unharmed. Lieutenant Browse shot 65 rounds. After each raid, Captain Soll would hold endless conversation with each battery, explaining why we did not hit anything. The next time we were ordered to aim not at the flyers, but to put a concentrated fire over the depots. At the first meeting, I noticed that most of the battery commanders were overaged officers, while their deputies were younger ones of my age, evidently sent here for a rest. Metz was ranked as a first-class fortress. In peacetime, it had 61,000 inhabitants, of which 25,000 were soldiers. France had to surrender the fortress after the War of 1870–71, and quite a number of the inhabitants only spoke French when I was there. The streets were narrow and crooked, dominated by the large cathedral built in the 13th century. Whenever bombers made a raid, they always hit something, and seeing part of Metz burning was a common sight, exciting no one. The town had nothing to offer for amusement, and I never went down to look at the bomb damage. Restaurants would not serve their bad meals without a ration card. During the summer, the heat was intense, and never again did I see a town so dusty and full of flies. We had no reason to leave our comfortable hill. June 23rd was a lively day. Several bomber squadrons came over and we shot 120 rounds. Later on, the sky became cloudy and we hoped for a peaceful night. But from midnight until 3 a.m., they came back. The searchlight crews had trouble holding the targets, and we seemed to do no good at all. Large fires started burning in Metz. One big Handley page circled our battery at leisure and loot. Browse seemed to have a good time banging away. I watched from our pergola, sipping some more of his latest mixture. All this warlike activity seemed perfectly harmless to me, and I wondered why my wife could not simply buy a railroad ticket and visit me. Metz still was full of civilians, and they paid little attention to the bombing. What difference would one more civilian make anyway? But I found out that the commanding general of the Metz garrison first had to give his permission. To my astonishment, permission was granted promptly, but I began worrying about the safety measures. To let her live in a hotel downtown was much too dangerous. She would be safest with me on the fort. No enemy plane ever attempted to attack us with bombs or machine guns. While we were shooting, she could go down into the fort where she would be perfectly safe. But how could I get her to the fort? I did not want to ask Captain Soll. He was the cautious type and certainly would say no. However, he came regularly for inspections in his car, which did not have rubber tires, only ordinary wagon wheels, and they made quite a racket while coming up the rather steep hill. That would give me plenty of warning. I did not know what orders or regulations I was breaking by bringing her up to the fort, but I considered it a very slight risk. Captain Soll had no standing as a soldier, and if he would accuse me of a serious offence, I was sure my friend General von Herpner would laugh it off. Of course, I had to tell the crew, and they were very enthusiastic about it. There was only one train, and it arrived at night at irregular hours to avoid being bombed. It would arrive any time between midnight and early morning, carrying passengers and everything else needed to supply the armies in front of Metz. Losses caused by bombings were kept as secret as possible, but it became known that one bomb once hit the diner filled with soldiers. In case of enemy action, we had to get my wife off the railroad platform and down the steps quickly, load her into a truck, and then step on the gas. We decided to equip our closed truck with a sofa, blanket, medicine, and bandages. Next to the sofa, Lieutenant Browse had placed a bucket with ice and a bottle of champagne. To be prepared for everything, I showed my wife's picture to the men, and they knew they had to bring her out dead or alive. On July 3rd at 3 a.m., the train finally came puffing in. It was a cloudy night and nothing happened. Our welcoming committee, consisting of 2 officers, 1 top sergeant, 1 chauffeur and 4 men, quickly lifted Dorothy into the truck. Before Lieutenant Browse introduced himself, he made her drink some champagne, and off we rolled. It had been a strenuous trip for her. The train was filled with soldiers and stopped very often for no apparent reasons. One woman passenger was going to Metz to attend the funeral of a sister killed by a bomb. Another woman seemed to be drunk, and her stories were not comforting. But now the trip was over. Inside the truck, we were quite a crowd, and everybody was quite amused by her travel adventures. For the first few days, I quartered her in a very primitive rooming house. We went for long walks despite the heat, flies, and dust. The front lines were not far away. Captive balloons, many of them, were clearly visible. To see a flaming balloon come down was quite an adventure for Dorothy. During our walks, we often saw attacking bombers coming over in formation. Once we were bathing our feet in the cool Mosel River on a very hot day about a mile outside of town, when all of the flak batteries opened up. Bombers came flying right over our heads. It was a fascinating spectacle which we watched in comfort and without thought of danger. Suddenly I heard some big pieces of shells coming down and land with a thud close by. We threw ourselves to the ground, but I was frightened. What a silly situation to be in. It could have been bad. These splinters from our own shells must have done considerable damage, but I never heard of anybody being killed by them. Trouble started when Lieutenant Browse obtained a 2-week leave. Now I had to stay at the fort day and night, so I took Dorothy with me. My men became quite fond of her and did all they could to make her comfortable. They even strung an extra telephone line to our iving quarters in the fort, so they could warn us whenever Captain Sol's car puffed up the hill. It worked very well. One day the good captain came into quarters while Dorothy was hiding in the closet. This really was a silly thing to do. Had he discovered her, it would have been difficult to introduce her as my wife. While she lived on the fort, we had the usual alarms and shootings. I delegated one soldier to stay with her downstairs, but I did not realize that the firing of our 88mm gun overhead made an almost unbearable noise, echoing with tremendous force through the concrete roof and walls. It frightened her at first. Soon another crisis arose. Our battery was ordered to take position on another hill fort a few miles closer to the front. I was told to identify myself to the infantry sentries at the bottom of the hill. I knew these sentries would never let a woman through, and I had the feeling something drastic had to be done this time to keep Dorothy with me. My men were very loyal to me, and I knew they would not blabber about it. All of them thought the whole thing would be a big lark, and a good time would be had by all. By now, Dorothy had become a sort of battery mascot, and we were not giving her up that easily. So I gave her my officer's overcoat and cap. She stuffed her hair carefully inside. As we approached the sentries, we had to stop for routine identification. The sentry looked at the driver and then saw 2 officers, one apparently sleeping with his head down. The sentry promptly waved us on. This time I had to take a bigger chance. The sentries at the foot of the hill clearly indicated that no civilians and no women would be allowed to enter this fort. On August 8th, Dorothy's visiting permit expired, and she had to leave. Outgoing trucks were not inspected, and we had no trouble, but I could not bring her to the depot because Lieutenant Browse had not yet returned from his leave. Her train departed just before sunrise without enemy interference. The Americans attack. A week or so later, the enemy increased his bombings. On August 15th, our gun positions were bombed for the first and only time. All 3 bombs landed on the slopes of our hill without doing damage. That day we fired 120 rounds, and so it went in routine fashion until September 12th, when the new American army mounted its first major attack in the St. Mihiel sector, 7 to 10 miles in front of our position. Before describing this action, let me give some information about the overall situation on the Western Front. The German armies were in very bad shape. Every soldier and civilian was hungry. Losses in material could not be replaced, and the soldiers arriving as replacements were too young, poorly trained, and often unwilling to risk their necks because the war now looked like a lost cause. Since the Allied breakthrough on August 8th in the Albert Moreuil sector, the enemy's superiority in men and guns became visible to even the simplest soldier, and morale was breaking down gradually. On that same day, August 8th, 7 German divisions were routed by a fierce tank attack, and for the first time the German High Command realized the German soldier could not hold out much longer. Peace feelers were sent out with the help of the Swedish and Swiss governments, but the Allies knew that Germany was beaten, and therefore were in no mood for talks. And now a brand new and large American army was ready to attack. A few days before, I had seen about 20 American soldiers who had been taken prisoner and were marching by to be shipped to some prison camp. They looked healthy, well-fed, and above everything else. Their marvelous clothing and uniform accessories impressed us. Everything they had seemed to be of the best fine heavy boots and thick and solid leather for their gun holsters, belts, and gloves. All of them were chewing furiously, which confounded the bystanders until I explained to them the importance of chewing gum to the American way of life. Most Germans never had heard of chewing gum. I never had seen chewing gum myself, but I knew about it. General Pershing was anxious to test his army. He ordered it to straighten out and eliminate the German lines jutting into the sector like a long finger 25 miles deep and about 10 miles wide in the middle. It took too many German troops to hold the 25-mile-long sides. When these troops were packing up to retreat, the American attack near St. Mihiel surprised them. American troops pierced both sides, and orders were given to the Germans to manage a fighting retreat. From our hill, we clearly could see that something fairly big was going on. Exploding shells in great quantities were everywhere, and all hell suddenly seemed to break loose. Although we were only some 7 miles behind the battlefield, it was impossible to guess how the battle was going. Nobody in Metz appeared to be alarmed, but while all this was happening, every window in the town and in our fort rattled more than I had ever heard before. A few broke. General Pershing succeeded, and when it was all over, the front line was straight. On the second day of the St. Mihiel battle, September 13th, a neighbouring flak shot down a bomber after it had done great damage, coming in at 100 yards. About half the town seemed to be in flames. For the first time, very heavy American shells exploded close to our fort. They were aiming at the Mosel River Bridge at the foot of our hill. The next day, September 14th, swarms of bombers came over in waves, and we fired all day long and part of the night. On September 17th, we heard that our allies, the Austrians, were suing for peace. The end seemed near. Our Army High Command wanted to hold out and fight, hoping our enemies might find the going too costly. Personally, I had no strong feelings about victory or defeat. I had read enough to know that the river of history never ceases in its flow, and that its course is capricious, meandering, and quite unpredictable. I was sure we had lost the war, but with the exception of a small strip of East Prussia, no enemy had crossed the German border. The German people had suffered much less than the French, Belgians, and Russians, on whose territories the battles were fought. I could not see much advantage in being the victor. Each individual and all of the soldiers fighting each other at this moment somehow would still have to make a living and build up their own lives, winner and loser alike. Those were the thoughts I jotted down in my diary at that time. On September 22nd, the commanding general defending Metz praised the flak for the first time, saying they had shot down 12 bombers. That astonished me. It must have happened while I was sleeping or paying no attention. I did not personally see a single plane come down. On October 13th, we heard about President Wilson's famous 14 points, which had to be accepted before peace negotiations could start. Nobody in our outfit seemed to be interested in these fine points of international diplomacy. We lost the war. Let's finish it the best we can and go home. In short, I saw nothing catastrophic in losing this war. It happened before in history. Nations and people always survived. I thought I would end the war here at the fort, although I could not quite picture the end. If the victorious Allies intended to enter Germany without granting an armistice, they first would have to conquer Metz, and in that case we would have to stand and fight once more. But what could we do? Our guns could not be lowered enough to fire down the hill, and would be more or less useless. We had 2 machine guns. To some staff officer it might look on paper that 2 88mm guns and 2 machine guns could hold a hill for a long time. But in reality, we were helpless if infantry should come up the hill of ours. As far as I knew, nobody had any worthwhile experience in firing machine guns. Without previous warning, I received orders on October 30th to report the next day to the commander of Heavy K-Flak Battery No. 112, stationed near the little town of Gortz. Gortz was 7 or 8 miles in front of Metz, where our lines had stabilized after the St. Mihiel battle. To leave this comfortable assignment and once more join a front-line outfit came as a bad surprise. Before joining K-Flak 112, I reported to the group commander of that district, He was not there, but his aide enlightened me plenty. He expressed his regret that I had to join this battery, but the second in command, a lieutenant, was sick. He then went on to say I would have a very hard time because the captain of the reserve commanding the battery was an impossible person to get along with. According to the aide, this captain was incompetent, a liar, a coward, and hated by his men, and nobody could understand why a man of such character had been promoted to officer rank in the first place. But so he said, I should defend myself and not give in to him. It was a queer conversation. This man gave me to understand that in case of serious trouble between the captain and myself, the group commander would take my word and not his. I expected all kinds of difficulties, but the commander of K Flak 112, I have forgotten his name, seemed to have no standing whatever with his superior. If he ordered me to do some foolish thing, I would refuse. I felt quite confident. When I reported to the battery the next day, the captain looked harmless enough, a small, squatty man on the fat side. I noticed he had no battlefield decorations of any kind, and I could not help wondering what he had done all this time. He received me in very friendly fashion and said he knew my name from dispatches published in the army newspapers. It was time for some sort of supper when I arrived, and he apologized that he already had eaten. However, he had saved something for me. In came the most wonderful supper I had seen for a long time. 1 whole partridge, cabbage, a potato, and red wine. That fellow greatly rose in my estimation, for at least he had a talent obtaining good food. I thanked him. He opened up another bottle of wine and began explaining the local situation, which seemed to be desperate. Facing us was a huge American army of fresh troops which had not participated in the last Saint-Mihiel battle. They were anxious to prove their worth on the battlefield. Intelligence reported increased preparations every day for a large attack in our sector. American superiority in guns was estimated at 17-1, with supplies of unlimited ammunition. Our worn-out infantry in front of us would be overrun quickly and engulfed in a sea of fresh and excellently equipped soldiers from the United States. Our guns were in position in a forest surrounding us on all sides, and enemy soldiers coming out of these woods could shoot us up with the greatest of ease. Because the trees were so close, we could only shoot upwards. This would be satisfactory as long as we could function as an anti-aircraft battery. We were apprehensive and wondered if the Americans would get us before the war would end. On November 7th, I had my only disagreement with the captain. A lone artillery spotting plane came over our position at dusk, a time that was best for spotting artillery flashes. Our gun positions were well camouflaged with branches and nettings, and I had ordered the men not to move around while the spotter plane was nearby. At that time, the captain was about 500 yards behind in our quarters, and of course had seen the plane. He phoned and ordered me to open up and shoot the plane down. This was a very foolish order under the circumstances, and I argued with him at length. The conversation became a little heated, and I flatly refused, calling the idea just plain stupid. Now he began to irritate me. He hung up and I did not shoot. He himself had told me the American superiority in guns was overwhelming. Had we fired, the spotter plane would have radioed our position within seconds, and we would have been buried under an avalanche of heavy shells. It would have been suicide. We would have been blasted off the map. The end. On November 8th, we heard a revolution had broken out in Germany. It had started in the Navy. Since the Battle of Jutland, fought in May 1916, the officers in the German battle fleet considered themselves superior in skill and seamanship to the British Navy. The prospect of being forced to surrender their proud ships because the army was collapsing seemed completely unacceptable to them. The Battle of Jutland was the only full-scale sea battle of the war, with both sides appearing in full strength and clashing in the North Sea, although the German fleet was outnumbered 3-2. Because night came, this battle was not fought to the finish. The British losses in ships and men were greater than those on the German side. Among our Navy's losses was the battleship Posen, commanded by the brother-in-law of Lieutenant Schroeder, who had been my commanding officer for most of my time in Russia. I still remember when the telegram announcing his brother-in-law's death arrived while we were eating. Now, when the end was in sight, the German naval officers intended to go out and go down fighting. When orders were given to the stokers to fire up the boilers, they refused. The crews were quite unwilling to sacrifice their lives in this useless gesture. For the first time in German history, seamen refused to obey their officers, and fights broke out on several ships. Some captains were killed in the following confusion. The revolution was on, spreading very quickly to the army. The whole might of the German armed forces collapsed almost overnight. Sud 105 Denley, men who had been disciplined soldiers and seamen, became an unruly and dangerous mob armed to the teeth, and were willing to murder anybody resisting them. For the orderly mass of German soldiers, all this was shocking and dangerous. Should we now fight these revolutionaries and start a civil war? Nobody seemed to know, and there was no overall leadership. The Kaiser fled to Holland, and General Ludendorff, the Chief of Staff, had fled to Sweden. Everyone for himself seemed to be the motto. That was the situation on November 11th, 1918, when the armistice was declared. What worried me most was the terrible news reaching us from home. Drunken soldiers roamed the streets. Even the police were reported to have joined the revolution. Some of these reports were exaggerated, but we did not know it then. The people at home were terrified. At this time, while all discipline apparently had collapsed, so-called Soviet soldiers and Navy councils were formed under the leadership of the worst elements. One of their main objects seemed to be getting rid of those officers they hated. As the battery captain and I were sitting down to dinner on one of the last nights, he found an alarming message on the table. I cannot remember for sure, but I believe the message was wrapped around a stone and thrown into our room. The message ordered the captain to leave the battery immediately. If he refused, he was threatened to be killed by a hand grenade. He lost his composure, and stripped of his power by the events, he was not much of a man. He begged me to drive him to the nearest railroad station right away. I did, driving the little passenger car belonging to the battery. Next to me was a member of the local Soviet Soldiers' Council, whose red armband served as a sort of passport. Fearing recognition as an officer, the captain had torn off his insignia and made himself very small in the back seat. The trip was uneventful. But what next? I had been with this battery only 10 days and did not know who the troublemakers were, nor did I wish to find out why they seemed to hate their captain. That might lead to arguments and would help no one. When we returned, the men of the battery attended one of the soldiers' council meetings. Being quite curious, I entered the hall and listened to what was going on. Conditions of the armistice gradually became known. We had to give up territory and retreat every day for so many miles. I believe it was 10 miles per day. Stragglers would be taken prisoner by the American army, following us a few miles behind. I must say that the men of that revolutionary council treated me with respect, and after a long palaver, asked me if I would lead them home. They realized we would obtain food and gas only if we marched as a unit. They promised to obey and did so. In this outfit, discipline never broke down after the men had eliminated their captain. Until the very last day we marched together. They addressed me in the third person and attended to the military courtesies as was customary in the German army. I had no difficulties of any kind. All K-flak batteries in our sector decided to march together 10 officers and 193 men. The march home ordinarily would have been a depressing affair. The weather was cold and rainy. The population knew that its territory between the French-German border and the Rhine River would be occupied by American and French armies marching a few miles behind us. In spite of this, the people were cheerful and did their best for us. Some towns and villages had erected welcome signs across the roads. But the tremendous joy and relief that the war finally had come to an end dominated our emotions completely. Whatever awaited us from now on in civilian life would be easy by comparison. I was not at all afraid of the future. It would be a very nice life, I was sure of it. It took us 8 days to reach the Rhine. We always had good, warm quarters, and most of the time the people with whom we were quartered invited me to eat supper with them. Often they asked me what had caused the revolt in the army. Why had discipline collapsed all of a sudden without warning? To begin with, it must be said that not all of the army was in revolt. Most of the men simply wanted to get home. They had no ambitions as revolutionaries whatever. There was no political leadership anyway. It simply was a revolt against authority by a small part of the army. For more than 4 years, strict discipline had been enforced. Men and officers, some of them 4 times wounded, had to be sent back into the front lines. Some regiments were thrown into battle time after time, while others occupied quiet fronts. It was impossible to distribute the burdens and dangers of combat fairly. So much of it was due to good or bad luck. When the news reached the army that some Navy men successfully had defied their officers for the first time in history, and had even killed some without being shot themselves, some of the simple-minded soldiers in the army thought a new, wonderful way of life had arrived. But before they could exploit this new life fully, they had to get rid of their officers, and after they had chased them away or had killed them, all the pleasures of a full life would be theirs. From now on, they would be on top, so they thought. My opinion always has been that only a small proportion of the army had gone berserk. Too many hardships and too much suffering temporarily had transformed some German soldiers into stupid and dangerous crackpots. Nothing could be gained by a revolution. The German government as we knew it during our lifetime already had been swept away by events. Imperial Germany did not exist anymore, so what or whom did they want to overthrow? There was no sensible answer. I felt this trouble would pass. Still, it worried me to be surrounded by thousands of soldiers, most of them obeying orders and behaving well, but some in a state of revolt against all authority and heavily armed with rifles and hand grenades. I had not carried a revolver since I was promoted to officer rank because sidearms handicapped movements, and I thought them useless. But now, we all carried sidearms to protect ourselves from drunken, marauding soldiers who might appear at any time. The overall situation was lawless, and we worried about what might be going on in our hometowns. Rumour had it that some good and loyal divisions already were fighting inside Germany to restore order. On November 22nd, we reached the Rhine Bridge near Kaiserslautern. Dirty and sloppy-looking revolutionary soldiers wearing red armbands stopped us and refused to let us cross the bridge. They feared our cannons, as well as the thought that our whole outfit would join the counter-revolutionary army, rumoured to be forming beyond the Rhine, out of reach of the French-American armies that would stop at the river, according to the armistice conditions. So I palavered with them a little. They were quite orderly and polite, but I really did not care what happened to the guns. According to the armistice conditions, the guns were to be surrendered and turned over officially to the French or American armistice commissions at some assembly point anyway. I agreed to let these men have the guns against proper receipt for 2 motorized flak guns, 2 trucks, and 1 passenger automobile. After these formalities were over, we parked the vehicles on the west side of the Rhine and then proceeded on foot to the other side of the bridge. I shook hands with every man and dismissed them with instructions to get home the best way they could. That was the end of the war for me. 7. Hard times at home. My last report to K-Flak headquarters in Hanover, which included the receipts for the guns, must never have reached there. For several months they asked me all kinds of questions as to the whereabouts of the guns, trucks and auto. Finally, I refused to answer, and the matter went to sleep. I reached Bremen on November 24, 1918, and soon noticed my nervous system did not seem to function right. While in the army, I never had trouble sleeping whenever I had the opportunity, but now at home, I could not sleep. I felt weak and had horrible nightmares. I forgot how long it took me to straighten out, but it was some time. My family had survived fairly well. My father had lost a lot of weight. At the outbreak of the war, he had quite a stomach sticking out. Now he was a thin man. My mother was not as thin, but had lost heavily too. My wife had had no fat to lose, but the shortage of food, especially the almost complete lack of fat, had created physical and nervous disorders. The doctor said only a sufficient intake of solid food could cure her ailments. At home in Bremen, the local situation was bad. The Allies kept the blockade on to force Germany to sign the peace treaty they now were working out among themselves. Therefore, Germany could not import food and had to rely on its own resources for many months to come. The final peace treaty was signed on June 28, 1919, and even then, imports of food by a bankrupt Germany were slow in coming in. In the meantime, everybody did their best to find food for their families. There still was no overall German authority managing fair distribution of available food. In Bremen, city authorities did the best they could, trying to convince nearby farmers to deliver food to the Bremen market. But inflation had set in, and soon the farmers sold their produce at whatever the traffic could bear. Only people with money could pay these prices. What kept us going in reasonable comfort was my mother-in-law's pension. It amounted to £300 sterling per year, about $1,400, a large sum of money in inflation-ridden Germany at that time. Pounds sterling were equal to gold. The worse the inflation, the more marks we would obtain when changing the sterling into marks. But the food we craved, butter, sugar, good flour and meat, could not be bought at any price because the farmers refused to sell. On top of these difficulties, the lawless elements became more numerous and more dangerous. Break-ins of the homes of the wealthy were common. Prominent citizens were abducted and held for ransom. Workers' strikes were going on almost daily. I especially remember a strike by the workers of the waterworks. What they wanted I cannot remember, but we had no drinking water, no toilet would flush, and nothing could be washed. Water had to be dipped from the small lakes in a nearby park, out of the Weser River, or from anywhere it could be found. When that happened, the better elements managed a strike of their own to teach the strikers that we were not helpless. As a countermeasure, all activities ceased. No doctor would make house calls, no telephone would be answered, and all stores, offices and banks were closed tight. Everybody simply refused to move or do anything. The town went dead. This counter-strike hit the striking watermen and their families hard. After about 10 days, it was all over. A dangerous rift had developed between the common working man and the educated part of the population. Some sort of explosion, perhaps a bloody one, was possible. The local police were not effective or numerous enough. Nobody knew for sure which side they were on anyway. We were uneasy. A new revolution like the French one in 1792, with all its terrors, might break out. Who would or could protect the average law-abiding citizen? One day I received a phone call telling me that all Army or Navy officers and all citizens able and willing to carry a rifle should meet in a nearby school. When this meeting was over, I had joined the Bremen Stadtwehr, or City Defence Force, together with many other soldiers and civilians. We agreed to patrol all streets day and night, every day. A patrol consisted mostly of one man with war experience and one civilian, but always two men marching together. It was arranged for each patrol to protect its own city district as much as possible. Fortunately, my parents' house and the flat where I lived with my wife and mother-in-law belonged to my patrol territory. My civilian partners were often engineers of the famous Vulcan shipbuilding firm, where many of our submarines had been constructed. Now the firm was idle. Every man was armed with a loaded rifle, and each agreed to show up for patrol once a week or more in emergencies, without pay. Patrol duty lasted 1 day and 1 night every week. The overall commander gave us authority to shoot or arrest when forced to do so, although he obviously had no legal right to commission this little private army. It was an emergency measure to protect our homes and families from marauding armed gangs. After we went into action, the citizens breathed easier. We had no trouble whatever in my district. But to patrol the streets for 2 hours at a time in bitter cold on a snowy night was no fun. Yet nobody complained. It seemed as if our city defence forces had restored almost normal peace and tranquility when, in the beginning of February 1919, alarming news reached us. In the country outside town, several thousand men calling themselves Spartacus were assembling. Consisting mostly of the worst revolutionary elements of the now dissolved Army and Navy, they were armed with rifles and some machine guns for the purpose of taking the city of Bremen by force. If they succeeded, the worst could be expected. These men were tough and not afraid to fight. According to rumours, many already had infiltrated into key points of the city, and their machine guns were in position to dominate the main streets. Our private army was not strong enough or organised for large-scale fighting. Inside town, the situation was tense. It was dangerous to use the telephone in connection with defence measures. Orders to the members of our force had to be given by word of mouth or over the phone by code. At the same time, intentionally of course, another big strike broke out again and nobody worked. We had no lights or water. Everybody was waiting for the attack. When the first alarming reports came in from the country, the high command of our private army sent secret messengers to a loyal and orderly brigade of navy men, which was in camp in some villages 15 miles away. There were several such outfits in existence in Germany. These men and their officers had no jobs awaiting them, and by sticking together they hoped to last long enough to be incorporated into some sort of police force, which surely would be formed sooner or later. When our messengers had informed them fully, they were ready to move at once and fight for law and order. They had no artillery, but they did have some mortars and plenty of rifles and ammunition. A plan was worked out by which our city defence force would let the Spartacus men enter certain parts of the city, and when they had reached the main street leading to the Weser River Bridge, our force would attack them. Meanwhile, the Navy brigade of some 2,000 men would swarm over the bridge and mop them up from the rear, killing as many as they could. The Spartacus men entered Bremen the morning of February 12th, while our men offered light resistance. The citizens were terrified. A fight in the narrow streets could not lead to the annihilation of the enemy. They had to be drawn into the broad Kaiserstrasse leading to the bridge. That maneuver was quite successful, but at the last minute, 2 hours after the attack had started, a hitch developed. Our friends, the Navy men, could not come across the bridge because, unknown to us, a well-protected machine gun had been placed by the Spartacists on top of the bridge, with another one on the roof of a tobacco warehouse. Luckily, we had a small armoured car with a machine gun. One of the crew members was a member of my tennis club. When this car rumbled forward to take up the fight with the enemy machine guns, a Spartacus man with a white flag appeared, apparently wanting to talk to the men in the armoured car. As they stepped out of their vehicle, they were shot down and killed, riddled with bullets. It happened in full sight and everybody saw it. Thereafter, the Navy men swarmed over the bridge, and the city forces could not be stopped either. How many Spartacus men were killed in the following massacre, nobody knew. Very few prisoners were taken, and what happened to them also is unknown. Later on, some newspapers accused our side of atrocities. This battle restored order, and the Spartacus organization ceased to exist in Bremen. 11 men were killed in our city defense force. I had learned all this from my friends. I was not there because no one had given me orders. The day before the battle, I had been on patrol duty. My partner and I had arrested one of the local communist leaders, a screwball intellectual and portrait painter by profession, whom I recognized, although he tried to go through our roadblock camouflaged with a beard and dirty clothes. He offered no resistance. When I checked out to rest early the next morning, I was told I would be called in case the Spartacus fight started. When I reached our flat, the food situation was bad. My wife was pregnant and I had to get some decent food from somewhere. I climbed on my bicycle to visit some farmers with my pockets crammed full of money. I came back with some milk and a few eggs, but as I approached our street, I saw, to my utter amazement, some 77 shells screaming over our house and exploding close by. There was no fighting going on at all in our neighbourhood. I knew our side had no guns, but how did the Spartacus people manage to have artillery? It seemed quite incomprehensible. Bremen is a long, stretched-out city, and I concluded the artillery had to be in a park just a few blocks from our flat. As I ran up the steps, I found my family rather calm. One of the next shells exploded in a neighbour's garden, and another slammed into nearby greenhouses belonging to my godfather, Karl Kommer. Shooting into private homes and gardens made no military sense at all. I never found out the reason, but I believe the Spartacus men manning this gun had no idea how to aim or handle it. They simply put in some shells, pulled the trigger, and hoped they would kill somebody. Their sympathizers lived in a different district of town, but I was more frightened about my family than they were themselves, and I was in no mood to leave them alone. When it became known in the afternoon that the battle was over and won, people came out of their houses to thank their liberators. As we stood on the street to watch the proceedings, a group of Navy men came by and halted to rest. We noticed they had some Spartacus prisoners. This excited the womenfolk, and when Dorothy asked a Navy man what would happen to these rather miserable-looking prisoners, he replied, grinning, "Oh, we will shoot them in a few minutes." I thought the man joked, but Dorothy and her mother took it seriously, and hoped they would not do it right before their eyes. Nothing happened as far as I could see or hear. After the military power of the Spartacus was broken, I was ordered to be a censor, along with an elderly civilian businessman. Our job was to read every incoming cable or telegram in cooperation with the postal authorities. Only messages inciting the people to revolution or civil disturbances were to be stopped from reaching their destinations. Every day we received long cables from a Russian Revolutionary Committee in Moscow, addressed to the Bremen Workmen and Soldiers Council, urging its members to continue the revolution. Each cable sounded like a lesson in Marxism, apparently intended for people who never had heard of Marxism before. Religion is the opium of the people. Production must be in the hands of the people. Throw off your shackles, etc., etc. None of the cables contained any worthwhile and specific instructions of how to reach these goals. They only were filled with phrases out of some textbook for communists. The whole thing made no sense. Every day we threw these long-winded cables into the wastebasket without even reading them. In addition to these duties, I tried to make some money, which was almost impossible while Germany was still blockaded. Finally, in May and June of 1919, the final terms of surrender were handed to the Germans. This Treaty of Versailles was a lengthy document which the German emissaries were forced to sign. The Big Four, Clemenceau of France, Lloyd George of Great Britain, Orlando of Italy, and Wilson of the United States had struggled among themselves for 5 months concerning the fate of Germany. It was now a republic under President Ebert, a man my father knew quite well. He was from Bremen, where he had represented the working man in the city government, while my father represented the tobacco importers. Ebert was well respected and had been elected president of the German Republic. President Wilson had argued for a peace treaty that would permit the German people to exist. Wilson was not against reparations, but he and his advisers feared an excessively harsh and humiliating treaty would only lead to more bloodshed and revolt, and possibly to another war. The other three of the Big Four considered Wilson an idealistic fool who simply had no idea how a defeated enemy should be treated. Wilson's idea of a League of Nations was another impossible dream in the then prevailing atmosphere of hatred and revenge. When the American Congress even voted against Wilson and refused to have anything to do with the League of Nations or further European entanglements, Wilson's influence in European affairs came to an end. Now France and her allies had Germany at their mercy. As most historians now agree, the conditions of the Treaty of Versailles simply could not be carried out. At first, things went fairly well. Germany surrendered whatever tangibles it possessed, such as what was left of gold, silver, the merchant fleet, colonies, and everything that could be moved, including many thousands of cattle from the farmers' fields. But when it came to payments out of profits, the impossibility of it all became apparent. The treaty said Germany must pay a minimum of $25 billion in gold. How could such a sum be earned? The Allies intended to take all normal profits until Germany had paid all war costs. What would happen to the German people was of no interest to them. When payments of money ceased coming, the French army marched into the Ruhr, forcing the miners to work at bayonet point to mine coal to be shipped to France. They refused and fought the French with homemade weapons. The miners became heroes and were cheered, but the overall situation remained terribly insecure, and nobody knew where the next meal would come from. And so it went for quite a while. The government the First Republic established in Germany had no power, no money, and could do nothing to help the people. Germany's population, in the tradition of the desperate, was now ready to listen to anybody promising food, work, and a normal life. We were a democracy, but everyday problems of existence seemed to get worse, and people began doubting the efficiency of such a form of government. A strong man was wanted. Newspapers began talking about a man called Hitler, a paperhanger by profession, who had survived the war as a corporal. On the face of it, he appeared to be some sort of uneducated crackpot, but the papers reported that thousands of people in Munich listened to his rantings every day. The rest is history, and President Wilson's fears proved absolutely right. A dream comes true. I became very anxious to leave Germany. My brother in America wrote that I should go to Rotterdam to see the American consul, who already had instructions to visa my passport and permit all of my family to go to the United States. Our hopes rose. When I reached the consulate and told them what I wanted, the atmosphere was very chilly. I was interviewed by a male assistant about my age. I never saw the consul. My explanations that I was a tobacco buyer and wanted to purchase tobacco for my father's firm, and that I had a brother who was an American citizen, seemed to interest no one. They wanted to know what I had done in the war and where I had been during the past 4 years. Maybe they thought I was a war criminal. When it was all over, I was told the United States did not need and did not want people like me. Then another man gave me a lecture, explaining how much better the American soldiers were than the British, French and Germans and so on. A complete fool, I thought. I returned to Bremen empty-handed. I explained this fiasco in a letter to my brother, who promised to take up the matter with the State Department and Representative Barkley of Kentucky, who much later became Vice President of the United States. I continued my services as a censor and patrolman in the City Defense Force, which was necessary because the mood of the people in sympathy with the Spartacus communist movement was ugly. Although their military organization had ceased to exist since the fight of February 12, 1919, the men of that group were still on hand and our enemies. One day my wife and I went for a walk. Living on the edge of town, we soon found ourselves somewhat lost amidst many small plots of land, where people seemed to live in shacks, trying to raise potatoes and vegetables. We got into an argument with a man who used very abusive language while ordering us not to go further. Of course, he had no right to order us around. When we went on, he apparently lost his senses and became crazy. He ran toward us, a heavy, long-handled army spade over his head ready to kill us, or so it seemed to me. As a weapon, I carried a walking cane with a steel blade sharply pointed and able to pierce and kill a person. When this blade confronted him, he knew he could not hit us without a fight, and he hesitated. I had to retreat slowly to stay out of reach of his long weapon, my pregnant wife frantically pulling me away from the man. After a little while, he lowered his spade and the danger was over. It all happened so fast we had no time to be afraid, but later on we realized it had been a close shave. As to law and order, times were not normal. To have been entangled in a bloody fracas, perhaps even a manslaughter case, might have meant the end of plans to go to the United States. To make some money while waiting for our U.S. entry permit, I founded the import firm Friedrich L. Nagel, Langenstrasse 70, Bremen, which was my father's office. We had a German friend in Cuba from whom I bought garden furniture. I cannot remember whether these transactions were profitable, but my speculations on the German stock exchange brought in substantial profits in inflated marks, which went down in real purchasing power every day. To own or try to keep paper money made no sense. It had to be exchanged into something tangible, anything from jewelry and fine paintings to grand pianos. Of course, these manipulations made inflation progress that much faster, until the mark was worthless. As a gamble, I left a large amount of paper marks in a German bank on deposit. At that time, it represented a value of about $1,000. If the mark ever would regain its normal value of 4 marks to the dollar, we would have had a small fortune. But later we received a short notice from the bank in Bremen, saying the inflation had wiped out the value of our deposit, and therefore the bank could not afford to keep our account on its books. We took a bad gamble, but it should be remembered that around 1920, a phenomenon called inflation was something brand new in a nation like Germany. Nobody could foresee the outcome. It was financial chaos, against which everybody fought according to their own ideas and plans. Finally, after months of waiting, we received good news from my brother in Kentucky in August 1921. Mr. Barkley and former Secretary of State Lansing had written to the newly established U.S. Passport Division in Berlin to grant entry visas to my family. This consisted of myself, my wife and infant son, Fritz. My mother-in-law, being a British subject, had no trouble and went with us. Not knowing what types of quizzes we might be subjected to, we were somewhat uneasy and fearful as we entered the U.S. consul's office in Berlin. In line behind us stood an American citizen of German extraction, a Mr. Schmoller. He sensed our uneasiness and helped us a great deal in steering us over possible tricky questions asked by the examiner. If the examiner was convinced we would not make good citizens, he still would refuse to visa our passports. This smiling Mr. Schmoller acted as if he knew us, and things went wonderfully well. It so happened that Mr. Schmoller was fabricating pianos in Omaha, Nebraska, and because he was sailing on the same ship, we became friends. On that first trip to the United States, while still on board, we bought sight unseen from Mr. Schmoller the piano that is still in my son Frank's house, the SS. George Washington had been one of the North German Lloyd luxury liners, and now was operated by an American line which had received the ship as a war reparation. Life on board was gay and carefree. General Pershing and his staff were one of the main social attractions. When we crossed the gangplank to board this beautiful ship, we entered a new world so very different from the dismal atmosphere which had permeated everything and everybody in Germany. The rich food, after years of eating anything just to stay alive, was a pleasure we enjoyed tremendously. But the food and the sea made me sick. We celebrated my oldest son's second birthday on board. He had a wonderful time, going from deck chair to deck chair, visiting only the men and trying to go through their pockets. There were very few Germans in first class, and the Americans we met on the ship were as friendly to us as they could be. It was a good omen. Our train from New York reached Paducah, Kentucky on Halloween Day in 1921. Now we could begin to build a new life. I was 29 years old and could speak only broken English. Up to now, and for some time to come, the conversation at home was in German until I became more proficient in English. The joy we felt, and the relief to have escaped from a Germany in turmoil to this wealthy and friendly land of opportunity, has never left us.